Hi, I'm Micah Woods, Chief Scientist at the Asian Turfgrass Center. Welcome to the ATC Doublecut. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about the turfgrass growth potential. This is based on temperature. It was developed by Pace Turf, and in fact, you may have caught a recent ATC Office Hours episode with special guest Dr. Larry Stowell from Pace Turf, who developed the temperature-based growth potential. And he talked about in that episode how that was originally designed to look at overseeding, specifically in the Palm Springs area of Southern California, to look at when the temperature was optimum for cool season grass to be interseeded into warm season grass, typically Bermuda grass, Cynodon in that part of the world, and trying to figure out the time where it's going to work just right, and to explain when the overseeding didn't work, to try to explain that based on how the temperatures were and how the growth potential was for the cool season grass compared to the warm season grass, because different grasses grow differently at different temperatures. I've been receiving a lot of questions about the growth potential, and because of that, I have been writing a few blog posts about it. The most recent episode of the Doublecut, I talked about using growth potential as a proxy for season length, where you can do that. You can do that by calculating a growth potential for every day, expressing that on a scale from 0 to 1 instead of from 0 to 100%, and then adding those together. So a day that's perfect for growth has a GP, a growth potential of 1. So that would count as a full day that's perfect for growth in terms of temperature. And a day where the actual temperature is far from the optimum temperature, that would have a very low GP, something close to 0. So that day would, like a dormant day, a day where it's so cold that the grass is dormant, that would be a 0. So if you add a whole bunch of zeros together, that's not growing season. But if you add a whole bunch of 1s or 0.5s together, half days, then that's your growing season. If you add them together over a week, then you could have, for example, 4 out of 7. If it's summed to 7 over the week, that would be your fraction of about 60% or so of the week was good temperature for growth. And you can do that over a month or over a year. So I talked about that in that blog post, which is in the most recent ATC Doublecut. And the next one, I looked at variance in the growth potential equation. And this is something that I also had a question about. Somebody was looking at the Pace Turf climate appraisal form, which is a spreadsheet that you can get from the Pace Turf website. I recommend doing this if you're new to the growth potential idea, because it has the equations embedded right in that spreadsheet. But it also has a couple of blanks or cells. It has a couple of cells in that spreadsheet that are labeled, I think one is labeled optimum temperature, another one is labeled variance. And the optimum temperature is easy to understand. For cool season turf, it's about 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. For warm season turf, it's about 87 degrees Fahrenheit or 31 degrees Celsius. And it's easy to understand that those are approximately optimum temperatures. What they are actually is the center of the optimum temperature range. So you can expect a little bit below 68 degrees Fahrenheit and a bit above that, something like 62 degrees to 75 degrees. Or in Celsius, it would be 16 degrees to 24 degrees Celsius. That's the optimum range where we can expect for most cool season turfgrass species. The temperature would be close to an optimum for net photosynthesis. That's how the optimum temperature for the growth potential equation is set. And if you want to read more about that, you can look at some of the links that I put in the office hours episode when I talked with Larry Stowell about how that was actually developed, or you can listen to us talk about that when he describes the development of the growth potential equation about, I think it was in the late 1990s that he came up with that. So anyway, in this climate appraisal form, there's an optimum temperature that you choose, and then there's also a variance. And I don't recommend changing the variance because it will change the shape of the curve. And I made a chart on the website that shows on my blog, and I titled this chart Effect of Changing Variance in the Growth Potential Equation, because somebody had asked me what the variance was, and it's a variable that goes into the equation that calculates the growth potential number based on the temperature. If you have a low variance, then it means the growth potential that gets calculated will rapidly drop down to zero as you move just a little bit away from the optimum temperature. I did an example using Celsius degrees and using the growth potential for cool season turf. And when I did that, I did one line, I did an example with the variance variable set at 1. If I do that, as the temperature is 20 degrees, which is the optimum, it's at a peak. The growth potential is 1. That means the temperature is close to an optimum for growth. And if I use a variance of 1, which is much too low, the growth potential plummets as the temperature moves away from the optimum. And as we get down to about 16 degrees Celsius, the growth potential already goes to 0. But at an average temperature of 16 degrees Celsius, we expect the grass will still be growing. So that actual variance doesn't work very well. If we set the variance at 2.5, we also get a growth potential that drops down to, it's less than 50% at about 17.5 degrees. It's less than 25% at about 16 degrees. And that also is dropping the growth potential too quickly, because grass can still grow pretty good at 16 degrees. It shouldn't have a growth potential of 25%. The standard equation uses a variance of 5.5, and I recommend keeping it at that unless you've got a very good reason to change it, because that gives a curve that moves away from the optimum temperature and goes down gradually, and it still hits 0 about the time when we expect cool season grasses to be dormant. So as we get below a temperature of 5 degrees Celsius, the growth potential is almost 0. As we get down to about 2 or 3 degrees Celsius, the growth potential will go all the way to 0. And what happens if you use a variance that's above the optimum value? No, optimum is the wrong word there. The standard value. If you use a variance instead of 5.5, which is the standard, if you use a variance, for example, of 10, now the growth potential that comes out of that equation doesn't go down fast enough as you move the temperature away from the optimum. So now, with a variance of 10, even at an average temperature of 0, the growth potential is still about 0.2 or 20%. But actually, the grass won't be growing. The growth potential needs to be 0 at freezing, because the grass doesn't grow when the temperatures are freezing. So it can't be 20%. And so basically, what this variance is a tuning parameter that goes into the equation, and it adjusts the shape of the curve. And when Larry Stowell and Wendy Galernter developed the growth potential, they set the tuning parameter, the variance, to have the shape that approximates the way that warm and cool season grasses are expected to grow. So that's what the variance is in the growth potential equation. That's a great question, and of course I I was so glad to answer that, but it's not something that you really need to worry about. It's interesting to know what it is when you're working with that kind of equation, to know why something is in there. But I recommend keeping with the standard. Now, somebody's contacted me after I put up that blog post, and they said they took some clipping volume data from their golf course and some temperature data from their golf course, and they plotted the growth potential that they calculated, and they also plotted the clipping volume, which is the growth essentially, over a 1-year period, and they found that they could get the curve to fit a little bit better if they adjusted the variance. And that doesn't surprise me, because you should be able to adjust the variance. I mean, you should be able to get a slightly better fit if you adjust the variance. But the problem is, once you do that, now you have a very unique growth potential number that is very difficult to compare with somebody else's growth potential number. And much of the value that comes in using concepts such as the growth potential, and these are things that I've written about in my book, The Short Grammar of Greenkeeping. You can find a lot of information about this on my blog, where I talk about some standard ways to compare turfgrass management practices around the world. Growth potential is kind of the foundation for that, and it's tricky when you start manipulating the equation into non-standard forms. You lose the ability now to compare your results or your growth potential, what's happening at your site at a certain growth potential, with what is happening at somebody else's site with a different growth potential. So of course we can adjust the equations, but what I recommend, if you do adjust the equation, do two things. Have one column in your spreadsheet, or however you're calculating this, that is the way that you've customized it, that works really good for you. Maybe it changes the optimum temperature, or it changes the variance to change the behavior in the tails of that curve. And have a adjacent column that calculates it in the standard way. If you do that, you now have your customized one and your standard one. And so if you need to compare growth potential data with anywhere else in the world, you know that you have the standard number. So you could say, okay, my average growth potential over the last week was 50%, for example. And you can compare that with other places in the world that are growing at a growth potential of 50%, if that was something that you wanted to do. But if you've got a customized equation that's now saying that you're at 74%, it's quite difficult to compare. So that's my recommendation for probably everything you'll ever need to know about the variance in the growth potential equation. I guess one more thing that comes to mind, there's two equations. Well, there's four equations. Let me explain this in full detail. There's two equations. One is for cool season grass, one is for warm season grass. The reason for having two equations is because they have different optimum temperatures. So you need to have two different equations for that. And then the original equations were developed to take inputs of Fahrenheit degrees, but they've also been modified to take input of Celsius degrees. Just make sure you're working with the proper equation. So essentially that's four equations that we've got, and whether you're using Fahrenheit cool season grass or Celsius cool season grass, or Fahrenheit warm season grass, or Fahrenheit cool season grass, or sorry, Celsius, I'm confusing myself here. The main thing to remember is they have different optimum temperatures. You want to make sure that you have the one that's suitable for the type of grass you have and for the temperature scale that you're using. And the other thing is the variances are different. So the variance is different depending on whether you're using a Fahrenheit equation or a Celsius equation. You can find all this in the climate appraisal forms. And if you have any questions about this, just let me know, and I am happy to try to explain it a bit further. Before I close this episode, I noticed that there is a new feature on Restream, which is how I'm recording this, which allows me to pretty easily get video and audio, sometimes have guests, and also share my screen pretty easily. And there's a new feature now that they automatically let you upload presentations and you can share them. So I just wanted to try out this feature. This is a 43 slide presentation that I'm not going to go all the way through. It's a presentation I gave in 2018 called Turfgrass Efficiency, the best playing conditions with the fewest inputs. And I just wanted to pull it up onto the screen and just flip through a few slides just to make sure that this is working. I think this is cool. This is something that the late John Scott asked me to do. And I mean, much of what I'm doing now, trying to share all of the presentations and trying to record video and audio that explains what I was talking about, is because of requests that John Scott gave me. And I wish he was still here with us so that I could know that he was watching it, because he was one of the most ardent readers of my blog. And if I count the opens of the website and count if I look at the feedback that he used to give me about what I was doing, it was a great private correspondence that we had, and sometimes public. If you'll see sometimes I quoted him on my blog and said, okay, John Scott wrote with this, I'm now responding to him. But much of what he asked me to do was to explain myself better and share more of the material, because I would go speak at conferences and he'd say, well, it was a pity I couldn't be there. I wish I could have seen your presentation. And I think it's so cool that this technology is now available, that it's available in a way that's easy for me to use now. And I certainly intend to keep doing this. And every time I do record a presentation or share anything that I'm going to make public like this, I definitely think of John Scott and his requests to do this, because he was so keen to learn, to continue learning all through his life. And yeah, I was just so impressed with the feedback that he used to give me about things on my blog that he agreed with, or things that he disagreed with, or things that he thought I was explaining things in a way that might be misleading to people or might cause problems, because he was really an advocate for the golf course superintendent. So he didn't want me to make mistakes either. So anyway, this is a presentation that I absolutely, I can't even remember where I gave it, but I really like the topic, the best playing conditions with the fewest inputs. And that's something that I talk about constantly. And I'm just going to start this. I'm definitely not going through all 43 slides. So I started by showing a picture of me reading a golf course seminar magazine column that I've written. And it's something where I was saying, this is something that I write about in magazine columns, like the column I write for Golf Course Seminar magazine. And I show the cover of my book when I was speaking at a presentation at Yokohama Country Club in Japan, together with the Golf Environment Organization and the JGA and the RNA. We were giving a sustainability seminar, and I explained that I've written about these kind of things, about efficiency and playing conditions and efficient maintenance in that book. And then I was going to give a highlight of it in this presentation, and I base it on my book, A Short Grammar of Greenkeeping, which I also put a picture of there. And then I went through a table of contents and so on. So I like this presentation so much that I may record it separately, but it's not part of the Double Cut series. So I'm not going to bore you with going through a presentation that you didn't happen to expect. And I think I can optimize the slides to make sure that I'm showing, I guess when I'm speaking to a video or to a podcast audience, I definitely want to optimize the slides and what I say so that I'm talking about something that goes pretty fast instead of something that's a bit more slow and interactive in the way that I typically would do it with a live audience. With a live audience, I like to pause and make sure everybody's following along and get some feedback, ask people in the audience sometimes to ask questions and interrupt me and tell me where they disagree or if they have any comments and so on. I can't really do that when I'm doing a video or a podcast. So my slides that have been set up in a way that I was planning to deliver them live, I think I can deliver that same message, but I may delete some of the slides or reconfigure them in a way. All right, that covers the variance. It covers this cool new feature that I think I'm definitely going to be taking advantage of here. And if you've noticed on the ATC blog, I've been sharing a lot of stuff that I think is interesting. So I've got a few more of these episodes that are going to be coming up, and I've done a couple of live streams, what I call ATC office hours. I've done a couple of those recently. You can catch those also on my same YouTube channel and on my ATC office hours podcast if you'd rather just listen to them. And especially relevant to what we've talked about today in this episode is the office hours I did with Dr. Larry Stoll, which talked for, I think, 40 or 45 minutes about growth potential, where it came from, how it's used. And I think it's something that can serve as a foundational way to think about turfgrass management, when certain maintenance practices should be done, and what the intensity of those maintenance practices should be at different times of the year. And then we also in that episode talked a little bit about MLSN and where MLSN came from. I will put links to as much of that as I can remember. I will put links to that in the show notes, in the description, and I will see you next time on the next ATC Doublecut. For ATC from Yantakau, I'm Micah Woods.